So this session will focus on mental health in AAPI youth. We'll start with data on Asian Americans in the Fort Bend County juvenile justice system, followed by research on what influences AAPI youth mental health and ways to support them. We have two panelists for today's session. We first have the Honorable Judge Julie Matthew and then Dr. Jeffrey Liu. I'm going to briefly introduce them. We'll have Judge Matthew speak, followed by Dr. Liu, and then afterwards we'll transition to a Q&A and a moderated discussion. And if you could please save your questions for that time, that would be helpful. So now let me first briefly introduce our first panelist. The Honorable Judge Julie Matthew is the presiding judge of County Court at Law 3 in Fort Bend County, where she oversees a diverse caseload involving criminal, juvenile, civil, mental health, probate, and guardianship, and eminent domain cases. With a passion for promoting positive change, she is the pioneering force behind the county's first juvenile intervention in mental health, a specialty court personally engaging with and supporting youth to foster their successful integration into society. Our second panelist, Dr. Jeffrey Liu, is a professor and interim department head in the Department of Educational Psychology at Texas A&M University. He's a developmental and learning scientist and has been nationally and internationally recognized for his expertise on social emotional development and emotional self-regulation processes in early childhood to early adulthood. A major strand of Dr. Liu's research focuses on individuals' resilience, thriving, and flourishing, including the risk and protective or promotive factors that are linked to developmental and academic or learning outcomes. And those are just abbreviated bios. They have extensive resumes and accolades that are available on the Hope Clinic website if you want to see more about what they've done, their educational journey, and the major accomplishments that they've had. So thank you for agreeing to speak today, and I will now turn it over to Judge Julie Matthew.
Good afternoon. Well, great to be here. I think I feel better standing up rather than sitting down. So probably better to stand up. My name is Judge Julie Matthew. I'm the presiding judge of County Court at Law number 3. And I was elected in 2018 and became the first Asian American elected to the bench in Fort Bend County and the first Indian American woman elected to the bench in the United States. So it's my privilege to serve on the bench. Not only do I do all the general jurisdiction court and its things, but handle mental health dockets specifically, as well as created the first juvenile intervention and mental health court. So I was asked to speak in regard to Asian Americans in the juvenile justice system. So I have never used this clicker per se, but we'll we'll just go directly into it. Oh, sure. All right. So is it let's see. Which button do I use? I'm using right and left and it's not working. So we're testing it out. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get here any quicker. There we go. Fort Bend County data for Asian Americans. So in 2019 is the first year that we were able to get data. There was about, I'm going to look at my numbers myself. There was about, the total refers for 2019 was 53,811. That's not that one. Hold on. I think my staff may have exactly put it not the way I needed it. Okay. So Asian Americans are under about 2,000. I mean, total referrals in Fort Bend County is under 2,000 for juveniles. If you see the little orange right here is how many juveniles that are Asian American. This is total detentions itself. Asian American detentions are a little bit lower, and then total commitments. Commitments are when they're either sent to TDCJ, which is the adult, or TJJD, which is the juvenile detention or juvenile. It's the same thing as an adult prison, but the juvenile side, they get a lot more rehabilitative options But really, the worst of the worst are the ones that actually get sent to TJGD, and all of us want to avoid that. All of the juvenile judges on the bench, our primary objective is to make sure these kids are rehabilitated, that they do not become repeat offenders, and that we help as much as we can. So the data actually goes down in 2020. COVID happens, it goes back up, and it really kind of goes back up in 2023. And so the numbers breakdown itself, there were a total of 2,051 referrals in Fort Bend County to our district attorney's office. Out of 2,051, 58 has been Asian American. The percentage is about 2.83. So it's still almost, it has gone down a little bit from 2019, the first year that we have data. But it is only 1.71 of the total percentage of referrals that come into the county in regard to juveniles that commit offenses. And out of those 58 Asian referrals, 9 has gone on to either TJJD or some other facility in regard to placement. And even if there's this many referrals, that doesn't mean they didn't get in trouble or that they didn't commit something. They could have had a deferred adjudication, which is a judge never even see them. So they do some sort of a probationary period. And as long as they follow and do what is needed from the prosecution, as well as the other programs that we have in place, the probation department, then they successfully complete that program and they're done with, and they never get to see a judge. And these are state of Texas for Asian Americans. In 2022, we don't have the data for 2023. In 2022, we had 42,831 referrals for Asian American and about 532 commitments. So those are, the commitments are the serious crime that they do end up getting prosecuted and some sort of afterwards either go to TJJD or when they become 19, go to TDCJ. And kind of breakdown of some of the numbers in regard to what they got in trouble for. The red is the aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The orange is assault causes bodily injury. The yellow is assault causes bodily injury family member, which is what we see a lot of in the court when it comes through. Crisis intervention. Let's see. Theft of property is a red. So over here in 2023, we had the highest for expelled from alternate education program. That means they were already in an alternate program. They were kicked out of their high school. They were already in an alternate school, and they were kicked out of the alternate school as well. And then possession of a controlled substance and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. So on my time on the bench since 2018, I've only had 2 Asian Americans that I personally have seen. One was controlled substance with a weapon, and then the other one was child pornography. So those are the 2 that I've seen on the bench. And then the breakdown in numbers and just the data wise, the same thing as a graph. This is a total breakdown in regard to juveniles in the system as opposed to just the Asian Americans. I think we can move on. So Asian Americans in regard to mental health assessments that we did. Let me do it. This is easier. So in 2023, every time a child comes into the system, they get assessed for mental health needs, whether we need to do anything or not need to do anything, all of them will get a mental health assessment. So out of 1,425 that's assessed, 44 of them were Asian American, a total of 329 that needed mental health needs out of all of the kids that come into the system, the 1,425, and 8 of them were Asian Americans that needed mental health. So out of the 44, 8 of them needed mental health needs. And so we provide through Texana, we provide the counseling or medication or give them access to whatever medical care that they need so that their needs are met as much as we can to provide that push. Some of them need to be forced med. So the judges also get involved and make sure that we do forced medication as well. And that is it. So a lot of things, one of the things that I do have to say in regard to Asian Americans in the system. We really just don't have the data. There's not that many. I think it may be a cultural factor. I came to the US when I was 10 years old with my parents. A lot of us, although I'm still first generation, I'm really probably second in some ways because I came at such a young age. So I still have that background influence of like what is expected out of me. And I think a lot of us who are Asian American who grew up in this country still know what our parents who really grew up back in the old country as to what is expected out of us, and what is required out of us. So I think there is that sense of, like if you don't do this, or we're here for a better life. And the whole purpose is to make sure that you get that betterment, the whole purpose of leaving behind everything, coming into this nation, wanting to create a better life for their children. And so it's that on our shoulders that we carry that I think that propel us to kind of stay out of trouble, do well in school. That in the model minority is definitely a myth. I believe in that. But at the same time, I think some of those cultural backgrounds, those influences, the discipline, all those things that come with being Asian American. I know that I carried that weight on my shoulders. I knew that, I'm the oldest of all the grandchildren. The first one to, if anything goes wrong, it's on my shoulder. So I knew that I had to do well. And I think it even propels me now of to just like wanting to do everything and anything. And sometimes I have to stop myself. But Dr. Liu is an expert in some of these things, and I really wanted to hear him as to how the generations of being here, what our, Chinese Americans have been here a lot longer than Indian Americans. Indian Americans, I think the wave started in the 1960s. Chinese Americans been here a lot longer than that. So I am interested to hear how the generations, as they come into this country and stay in this country, how things change for them. So I think Dr. Liu can probably expand on that. So here you are.
Thank you, Judge Matthew. So really, a lot of the things that Judge Matthew just said really resonates with me as well. I consider myself first generation immigrant myself. Some people might call me or us one and a half generation because we immigrated here pretty young, right? It sounds like from Judge Matthew, and for myself, in childhood or middle childhood. So a lot of the things that you talk about resonates with me, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with Judge Matthew and also with our audience members. But first, I want to share some of the research that I've been doing at Texas A&M with my research group for almost 2 decades now. So a lot of my work focuses on children and adolescents and their social emotional development and mental well-being, and particularly emotional self-regulation. So basically how people manage their emotions and their emotion-related behaviors. So for example, when you get upset, frustrated, can you manage the emotions and not act out? That's just one example. No worries. Thank you. So I want to share in particular a project that we did, and it was launched in 2011, so like almost a decade ago. And the project is called Project Castle, which stands for Chinese American Successful Living. And that project I started at Texas A&M to really study the mental wellness or mental health and the social emotional as well as academic competencies of Chinese American adolescents with first generation parents. And this project was supported by the Hart Foundation for Mental Health. And this project really is special to me because I was a brand new faculty member at Texas A&M. I really wanted to do research with the AAPI community. And I came to the Hope Clinic, and that was back when it was in a different space. So it's really exciting for me and meaningful for me to present some of these results from this project that I came to the Hope Clinic to talk about, to recruit families and to connect with families for this project. So it's really great to see what the Hope Clinic is now in this brand new space. Really impressive 3 floors, right? So really meaningful for me to talk about this work here with all of you. So just a couple of photos from the early years of this project. Some of the OG original members of my research team. These are graduate students of mine, and this was, I believe, at one of the Lunar New Year Festival celebrations here in Houston. So all of these former graduate students of mine have graduated with their PhDs, and now more than half of them are working as licensed psychologists. Many of them working with API communities and clients. So just really happy to see how this project has flourished in many ways. So as I mentioned, this project focused on adolescents with first-generation immigrant parents. And I focused on this population because these youth often experience, like Judge Matthew just said, some of this. These youth often experience bicultural and intergeneration pressures and also acculturative stress. We heard that in our earlier sessions. And acculturative stress happens when there are differences between the cultural values of the parent and the child, and that is very common given that these families are immigrant families, right? And for also, in addition, API youth, many of them experience racial discrimination, and that makes them much more vulnerable, obviously, for distress, trauma, and mental health problems. However, many of our API youth continue to find success in their education and professional lives, particularly when they have support within the family or school or the local community. So that is part of the resilience among the API youth community. So I want to talk a little bit about Asian cultural values because I mentioned about acculturation. And obviously, cultural values are diverse, especially because the API communities are also very diverse, right? But in general, there are some common themes that emerge. And there have been studies that have been done to identify some of the core Asian cultural values. So Kim and his colleagues in 1999 published a study, and they used interviews with Asian American psychologists, as well as focus groups with several large AAPI populations, so Asian Indian, Chinese Americans, and Korean Americans. And from those data, they consolidated the data to arrive at 14 core Asian cultural values in the United States. And I'm not gonna talk about all 14 of them, but I wanted to highlight just several of them that would be relevant to some of the things that we've talked about in our earlier session, as well as in this session, I believe. So self-control and restraint is one of the core themes that emerged from Kim and colleagues' research. And as I mentioned, one of my main focus for my work is on emotion regulation. And I think that is very connected to the aspects of how to control yourself, to restrain your emotions and your behavior. And that is one of the Asian cultural values in the United States. Another main cultural value that emerged from their research was the importance and ability to resolve our own emotional and psychological problems and not necessarily bring it to others, or especially not outside the family, right? And earlier on, we heard in the earlier sessions about stigma associated with mental health problems, and I think that's very connected to that issue. Many of us already know many of these things, but I just wanted to highlight collectivism, filial piety, and the importance of family, obviously another core value, avoidance of shaming our family, and then, the modern minority myth, Judge Matthew mentioned that, and is, I think, really connected to this, the importance of achievement in educational and our occupational lives. So those are just some of the core Asian cultural values that were identified in their research that I wanted to highlight. And I think a lot of those cultural values serve as backdrop for a lot of the things that we will talk about in this panel session. So emotion regulation has been proposed in the research literature to play a really critical role in helping children and youth to manage developmental transitions and challenges in their lives. And studies have shown, including some of the work that we've done at Texas A&M, that emotion regulation is a protective or resilience factor against internalizing and externalizing problems. And there have been emerging research showing that emotion regulation can also help ethnic minorities effectively cope with and also process their racial discrimination experiences. And also in the research literature, some people have talked about emotion regulation as transdiagnostic. So what that means is that emotion regulation may really underlie a whole host or a variety of mental health problems and issues. So I'm not saying that that factor can address all mental health problems, but the emerging research has shown that it does cut across a lot of behavioral and emotional difficulties and problems. So I now want to shift and highlight some of the main findings from Project Castle that I mentioned earlier that was really done in the Houston metropolitan area. So we collected data from Chinese American adolescents and parents who were all first generation immigrants. And we collected data across 2 different time points. At time 1, the adolescents were in high school. And then at time 2, that was 3 years later, our participants were in college. So the data really spans adolescence into early adulthood or emerging adulthood. So I'm not going to go into all the details, but one of the main research questions that we were really interested in is, whether and how parenting influences adolescents internalizing and externalizing problems through emotion regulation. So does parenting influence the adolescent's ability to manage their emotions? And then that would influence their mental health outcomes. So we tested that based on the data that we collected. And what we found was that intrusive or the more controlling type of parenting is linked to the adolescent's difficulties with managing their emotions. And one hypothesis is that, the more controlling type of parenting is not really aligned with the cultural values in the United States, right? So perhaps potentially the parents, from their heritage cultural perspective, they think that being more controlling, more strict is, culturally appropriate in their heritage culture. However, potentially in the United States, more autonomy is expected from their children. So that could potentially create parent-child conflicts, and then that could have an effect or an influence on the child's ability to develop emotion regulation skills. And then what we also found was that emotion regulation predicts or influence the adolescents externalizing or acting out problems, not their internalizing. We also found that indeed emotion regulation mediates or is a kind of middle factor between the effect from parenting onto externalizing problems or the acting out problems. I want to go back and really talk about really quickly how we measured externalizing problems. So we included measures on the young adults, really. By time two, they were young adults. The young adults' use of alcohol or alcohol abuse, attention problems, hyperactivity, and sensation seeking, or kind of risk taking. So another finding I want to highlight from this project was that we found more risk and vulnerabilities for males. And that is actually consistent with prior research. And we found that males were higher on externalizing problems than females in our sample. So as I mentioned, that includes alcohol abuse, sensational risk-taking, and some other factors, right? And particularly during early adulthood or during the college years, excessive alcohol consumption could be a form of externalizing problem, right? And in addition, males reported higher levels of hyperactivity and risk-taking than females. And I think this point could be very connected to some of the things that Judge Matthew talked about, and that puts these males more at risk for delinquency and antisocial conduct problems, which I think Judge Matthew in her data talked a little bit about earlier. So many of us are aware through the news and, perhaps you've witnessed it in your communities that AAPI youth are vulnerable to mental health distress, and also racial discrimination, and potentially higher levels of parent-child conflict. And discrimination and parent-child conflict has been identified as two of the main stressors for these youth in the research literature. And AAPI youth have reported an increase in severe depression, so 17% increase, and an increase in severe anxiety, 30% increase during the COVID-19 pandemic. And many of us are already aware and have seen in the news or in our communities, racial discrimination has increased for AAPI youth during the pandemic, and that has been associated with worse mental health outcomes. I want to highlight a very recent study that was just published in 2022. And in this publication, they did a review of 59 studies. And what they found was that APIs have experienced an unprecedented level of mental health challenges associated with increased anti-Asian racism during the pandemic. And more, not only to say that there are problems, but as part of their work, they're also calling for increased funding and increased efforts toward research, services, and policies for meeting and addressing the mental health needs of APIs. And we also need increased support and professional development of mental health service providers in cultural values and relevant ways of meeting the needs of AAPI groups, especially in regard to emotional expression, self-disclosure, and coping in culturally sensitive approaches. So this is some of the work that we recently published from my research group at Texas A&M. And in this study, we focused on Asian Indian adolescents in the United States. And we looked at racial microaggressions as well as overt racism among this sample or this population of Asian Indians. And we interviewed 9 second-generation Asian Indian Americans who were teenagers, adolescents, but all of them have first-generation immigrant parents. And we asked them to talk about racial discrimination, their identity as Asian Indians, and also how they manage that identity. And then through the interviews, we coded for the key themes. So some of our participants talked about specific scenarios that elicited feelings of fears. And they talked about hate crimes against Asian Indians, and then also the increased activity of white supremacist groups. So those were some of the key relevant themes that were on their minds as they were talking to us about their experiences. Most participants talked about their racial ethnic identity and talked about having the importance of having Indian friends as a support system. And they really saw that as a cultural asset, right? So they saw that their identity as an Asian Indian is an asset to them. And really just having friends who understood them as Asian Indians, having a sense of safety and comfort, especially during times of challenge and adversity, is really important as a protective or resilience factor. They also talked about code switching and the kind of the struggle of balancing, their Asian Indian identity as well as their American identity, right? And that goes back to acculturation, right? And how do you balance, at least 2 or more sets of cultural values and identities? So I want to share this one quote with you that I think really highlights this point from one of our participants. They said that Indian American, it means you live between 2 worlds. I come home, I'm Indian. I live Indian lives. I eat Indian food. I step over the threshold. I become American. Go to school, I'm an American. Your parents don't understand. Your parents don't kind of understand the Western world. And the Western world doesn't really understand that Indian world. You live between 2 worlds, and you've got to be knowledgeable to know how to balance them. So this is not an easy task, right? And,
Completely concur with that statement. This is the life that I led. You at home, I was an Indian American, go to school, completely different American. And so the weekend life where I go to church, an Indian church, or, as also a minority Indian American who's Christian, there's that 2% of us or 3% from India that are Christian. So we lead a complete different life. Nobody even knows that they're Christians in India. The questions we get asked is, oh, why is your last name Matthew, or my maiden name being Thomas? All those type of different identities that we have as Indian Americans at home, at church, are completely different. When I went to school, I played field hockey, was on the National Honor Society, all those type of things, completely different. You walk over a threshold each and every day as growing up in this country. Very interesting.
Yeah, and I look forward to more conversations and discussion with you, our moderator, Cassie, and also with our audience, and also on Zoom, our audience on Zoom as well. I also want to share another study that we recently published in 2022. And this is data from Project Castle. We were looking really at internalized racism, which isn't really talked about very much. and hasn't really been studied very much. And a lot of people haven't even heard about this idea of internalized racism. So what we found was that, we found an intergenerational correlation in internalized racism. And what do I mean by that? So Judge Matthew mentioned earlier about the model minority stereotype. So in a way, on the surface, it looks like it's a, there's some good things about that. But if we go, and someone said in the earlier session, if we go deeper, actually it's very harmful to many of our API youth and people, right? People of color. And so we measured both the parents as well as the adolescents' endorsement and acceptance of the model minority stereotypes. And we believe that that is one form of internalized racism because you've kind of bought in to all of these stereotypes about you. And some of them may not even be true, but somehow we, or many of us who are API members, might have even consciously or unconsciously internalized those stereotypes for ourselves, right? So that's a form of internalized racism. And we found, as I mentioned, that there is a correlation, meaning if the parents internalize those stereotypes about Asian being a model minority, their children also internalize that. So this finding suggests that cultural values of filial piety, which calls for respect and deference to our parents and elders in the family, might promote children's following of those beliefs and expectations from their parents, including the model minority stereotypes and those internalized racism, right? However, when parents and their children internalize those stereotypes, this acceptance might represent internalizing also like racism and thinking inadvertently that, obviously when it's very overt, we know it's wrong. But what about those microaggressions? So I think we really need to kind of think more carefully about some of these issues because we don't want to inadvertently maintain and self-perpetuate that cycle of oppression, right? So another study, this is another very recent publication from last year, 2023, also using data we collected through Project Castle. And we were very specifically in this paper looking at racial discrimination experiences in Chinese American youth, and also looking at the cultural values and coping strategies and coping styles that were used by these adolescents. And what we found was that a large majority, 84% of our participants talked about during their interviews that they have experienced discrimination because of their race or ethnicity when they were growing up during their childhood or adolescent years. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but they provided a lot of, they shared a lot of their experiences with us and really appreciate their trust and candor with us. And as I mentioned, I also wanted to look at how they coped with these kinds of racial discrimination experiences. And a large majority of them talked about using the coping strategy of reframing. And also another approach or strategy was minimizing or suppressing, those experiences or thinking about them. And then some of them also talked about acceptance. So, earlier on, I talked a little bit about like the danger of accepting racial discrimination And I think that speaks a little bit to that point as well. But in a way, in that moment, maybe that was a way for these youth to get through that experience, right? Because it is so difficult and so threatening, right? And so, but this is what we found. So findings suggest that our participants who had a weaker or poor sense of cultural or ethnic identity, they were more vulnerable to the stress and trauma from being exposed or experiencing racial discrimination and marginalization. And as I mentioned, three major types of coping strategies were identified, and those were reframing, minimization or suppression, and acceptance. And when they used, and we did analyses on this, and we found that when they used these types of coping strategies, they also reported fewer mental health problems. And they also, during their adolescence, and then when they were young adults, they have more positive interpersonal relationships. So it appeared, so I guess that point is that it appeared those types of coping strategies were effective for these youth at that time of their lives. So as I mentioned, they were adaptive. However, I want to also highlight that many of you who are practitioners and in the mental health field are aware that in the research literature on North American using North American samples and populations and mainstream North American cultural perspectives, these types of coping strategies are often labeled or called emotion-focused coping, secondary control coping, or even dysfunctional coping, and they are often considered not very effective and maladaptive. So I wanted to just kind of highlight that point, and it is important for mental health professionals to be sensitive to traditional or even current Asian cultural values in the US, particularly because it emphasizes interpersonal harmony, forbearance, and compliance or deference to authority figures, elders, and parents. And what is considered maladaptive or dysfunctional in North American culture could potentially serve adaptive or protective functions for AAPI youth, at least in the short term. I'm not sure because I didn't have data for the long term. Very long term, I had data for 3 years in, but at least during those periods, it worked and helped those youth to cope with those very traumatic and serious experiences. Now I want to kind of shift a little bit and talk about flourishing in spite or in the face of adversities and trauma. And flourishing is not just about surviving, right? Flourishing is defined by a combination of emotional, psychological, and social well-being, and is being able to cope, regulate with negative emotions, and being able to really process our experiences so we can heal, right? And therefore, flourishing is defined by growth and thriving after and despite traumatic and adverse experiences. And a lot of you in this room, all of us, I know, are working to help our young people to flourish and thrive, right? And I love to talk with all of you a little bit more and hear the work that you're doing and what you're doing to help our young people to grow and to thrive, especially when they are coming from adverse backgrounds and have dealt with so much trauma in their lives already. So as I wrap up, I want to highlight a couple of things. So a lot of my work I mentioned is really focused on emotional self-regulation and coping. And from my perspective, I think emotional self-regulation can be one form of what I call our young people's form of superpower, right? Like if we can really promote and support our young people to develop abilities to manage their emotions, then they can maybe deal with adverse experiences in a more effective way. Um, and racial discrimination, racial ethnic identity, and identity management are key concerns and challenges for many of our AAPI young people. And having a strong sense of racial ethnic identity is really a cultural asset that can protect them and give them resilience to deal with a lot of the experiences that they are going through. And the last point I want to make is that culturally congruent coping strategies can protect our young people from mental health problems and support them to have positive interpersonal relationships. And those strategies, coping strategies, may not look exactly the same as what may look like in the mainstream culture, right? So we want to be mindful and sensitive to that. So thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to talking with all of you about all of these issues.
Thank you, Judge Matthew and Dr. Liu. So we have about 20 minutes now for a discussion, questions. If the panelists have questions for the audience, or if the audience have questions for the panels.
I have a question, and first of all, thanks to both of you for such great presentations. I'm a retired educator, so both of your topics mean a lot to me personally and professionally. My question is, how has your research findings translated into either a curriculum or a professional development piece for educators?
That's a great question. And, you know, I'm a faculty in the College of Education and Human Development at Texas A&M. So it's great to hear that you're an educator. Oh, awesome. Howdy. So, you know, a lot of my work has not gone into curriculum yet. You know, a lot of them were just recently published. But I do hope that some of this research informs practice and curriculum development, not only my work, but other people's work as well, right? And I think that speaks to oftentimes that theory and research gap to practice, right? We need to really bridge that gap. And a lot of my interest also centers on social emotional learning, which I imagine you're quite familiar with. And I think in that space of SEL or social emotional learning, we are seeing a lot more of that research. As I mentioned, I'm very interested in social emotional development. So a lot of the research in that space is being translated and brought into the curriculum development of social emotional learning into our classrooms and schools. So I would love to hear more from you as well about your thoughts on some of that.
Currently working with two students from Rice University who've actually done some research, and I know them from their research and have met them, to actually go into schools to talk about mental health issues, to talk about the need for early identification. We find that young male adolescents particularly have mental health issues that aren't addressed. We heard earlier in another presentation that the sooner we begin discussing this in schools, the more the impact that we have. And I have worked in several under-resourced communities and still volunteer in some of those schools. So I believe that we can talk later, because ARP is working now on a project to bring this kind of information to schools. And we have two schools that are interested, all because we need to develop the mental concept needs for adolescents early. which impacts, I'm a caregiver for my 90-year-old mother and my 91-year-old aunt who has Alzheimer's, who moves with me. And all of what we do with your research very early impacts the kind of care that we provide later as older men, elder men. It also impacts how we grieve, which also impacts from the same cultural model, our mental health. So we're ready to talk after this session.
I'm super excited. I'm so glad to hear all of that, and I would love to have more conversations with you. I would love to collaborate and partner with you and do more work in that space.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I really, it's really broad. Like I came from the activism, so I developed curriculum. I didn't use that a lot. So your research really becomes some of the backbone that what I'm developing. So it's really resonate with all the things that you do. But when you mentioned about the superpower of self-regulation, actually, I am an expert in emotional intelligence. And I use a simple framework of 5 values. It's value-based program: gratitude, respect, accountability, courage, and engagement. And we had a kind of like virtual youth summit that having only 10 days, but it transformed the kids. And the age group is 14 to 18 years old. And it's all about the ability, first, awareness of the emotion, right? You have to know when you upset, and also the ability of coping, understanding and coping and regulate your emotion and own it. Having the courage to own it, and it's just so wonderful. So I have on the practitioner side, but I lack the resource, the research base of what you say. So I would like to continue to connect with you and get some of the research, and if we can work together on something that can leverage your research finding and then come with the practitioner to do something to serve the youth, that could be awesome. And thank you, Josh, for the information about, from the system, how Asian American youth part of the picture is really helpful.
I'm very excited to hear, your expertise on emotional intelligence, or EI. As you know, that's really connected with emotional regulation work. So I would love to talk more as well, and collaborate and partner as well. I'm so glad to meet so many like-minded people, and we all bring different strengths, and we'd love to, like you said, leverage all of our expertise and work and build something bigger and more to help more people in our communities.
When you were talking about the data for code switching and racial discrimination, I noticed that for a lot of them, I relate with them because my family is Nigerian. So like there's this expectation where it's like, if you have to go to medical school or law, you're a failure. Because I remember the time I was having a conversation with my dad, I was like, I want to be a journalist. It was like, you're not going to get a job. So go for nursing. I'm not going to support that. And it was tough. But overall, found out that, this is something I actually like. But I just feel like for other people, they don't have like any kind of support at all. And they go through this mental distress. Because like for a lot of our parents, they feel like depression is like for white people. But it's like when I talk to my friends, they're like, I have anxiety, I'm bipolar. So it's like, how do you translate this for like people of color in other communities?
There is definitely a stigma attached to Asian Americans, as well as I think all immigration population, probably in regard to mental illness or any sort of depression or anything that you deal with. And I know it's very prevalent within the Indian American community. I know in the Asian American general population, same thing. And the immigrant population, I think, you're here to succeed. You need to, this is a land of opportunity. When I was growing up in India, the first 10 years of my life, it was, the land of milk and honey. America was seen as that. And how do you come here, or how do you come to this country and then fail? Or, it was, I had several failures in my life. And for me too, it was the same thing. Like I let everybody down, and I had to work through that. to get through that. I personally think counseling is the best thing that any single person can do when they're going through some sort of encounter in their life where they're not. And I think our community has a hard time. They see it as a failure, more or less, as like getting help.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I mean, yeah, I think what we talked about today is not only pertaining, a lot of the phenomenon that we talked about is not only pertaining to API people, right? Many other immigrant groups also experience that. So thank you for sharing. I mean, what you said resonates with me too. And I think we're both like, yes, yes, we understand. Yeah, yeah.
This is a wonderful presentation. I have had opportunity, sort of, not maybe as in depth for judge's presentation, which I missed. I'm sorry, but this is something very close to my heart because there was a time when I used to work on this area before moving to cancer research. But with that said, I had a question for you when regarding the Indian American study that you did. Did you find any difference in terms of acculturation, the generation which is born here versus those who were migrants from India as students over there? How did they navigate between that threshold? What was the safety net for them? How did they cope with that? That's one question. And the other aspect, probably, I might have missed it, that how do we deal with disease? Starting from mental health, like even the one of the interest areas, and I'm currently working on, is the AYA population, right? So but in many of our immigrant population, the cancer itself is a big taboo. And how, as parents, we overcome that and help our younger survivors help through that process, and what are the emotional needs. And um, so, yeah, that's another question, if you have any insight on that.
So we didn't specifically measure acculturation in the study with the Asian Indian adolescents. However, through the interviews, we definitely heard from their voices their experiences of acculturation. And I think in the quote that I shared, I believe you saw, that speaks very loudly to me, the acculturation, because they're basically saying, hey, my parents don't understand me, so they're definitely, in a way, we didn't quote unquote measure it because it was a qualitative interview study. However, we heard it loud and clear through their voices and through quotes like that acculturation was a big theme and factor that they were going through. And they feel the difference in acculturation levels between themselves and their parents. And then your second question about disease, I'm not quite sure what you mean, but I would say that, mental health issues we talked about earlier is a stigma, and people don't talk about that. However, I know in my family, some of the, serious health diagnoses are also not talked about, that are physical health, like cancer, and I was kind of shocked, like when I learned, for example, my grandma, like I didn't know until like much later, So people just don't talk about. So thank you for bringing that up. And I'm not sure if that's what you mean, but yeah.
I know that we discussed this at some point or another with the Indo-American Cancer Network. And my dad, when he had cancer, prostate cancer 20 years ago, and then was hit with metastatic cancer about 2 years ago. And it was, my mom did not want a single soul to find out, could not discuss, could not talk about. It was hidden, couldn't, because it was seen as some sort of like negative. And I'm like, what's negative about it? Why would you not want social support? Why would you not want friends to have your back or come and help in some way or not? So it is definitely something I can understand what you're talking about. And culturally, at least within the Indian community, it's definitely not addressed. It's very much like, if you have a problem, keep it in your family, in your nuclear network, and that's it.
agree. I think, earlier I had a slide about not bringing shame to the family, and I think that's part of it. Yeah, definitely mental health, but like you said, any kind of problem that makes the family look bad, although why would it, right? It's like, yeah, but I think that's it.
I think it is shame. I mean, as much as that shame is such a bad word, but really even an illness is seen as a shame. It's like somehow you caused it, which is not it at all. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, in an earlier session, I think there was some talk about some cultural beliefs or religious beliefs about, I think it was a slide about like your faith is not strong enough, or there's some kind of weakness. So it's so complicated, right? So complex that you're right. It's not only mental health problems; it's physical health problems. It's any.
In the Indian community, I think it also is that, there are arranged marriages. You still are, you meet somebody else, and you don't want to marry from a family that has cancer in its genes. So those are, I mean, I think that's also a pertinent factor that affects what is disclosed and not in regard to health issues.
That's one of the factors which has affected our young adult and adolescent population because of the fertility ability in future. Then and going through cancer, oftentimes there are depression and anxiety and all other issues which people don't want to talk about because, again, for some reason in our immigrant culture, it's cancer is associated with the inability, something wrong with you internally. You did something, that's why it happened to you. Fatalism in a way. But so this is a discourse that I guess we need to continue. Another question which has always bothered me is how much parental mental health has impacted children mental health, especially for the immigrant culture. A whole bunch of parents comes with their own baggage of anxiety disorders, depression, and remains undiagnosed almost lifetime, and how they manage their emotions. And that's basically what they teach their children not to do. I mean, they're not able to cope their emotions as needed. So I wonder if you have any insights on that.
So what I guess when you're not talking about like, so I guess it depends on what kind of framework, right? Some people look at it like genetic, right? But I'm going to talk about more parenting. So I think if the mental health problem negatively impacts the parent's ability to attend to and care for the child or the family, then that would have an influence on the child's well-being and potentially mental health. And I know, even with very young children, right? I mean, they have done some quote unquote classic experiments, let's say, where they ask a mother with a very young infant child, and they ask the mother to not show any expression. So these mothers, some of them may have severe depression, but some of them they do not, but they're just asked to have a still face, right? Like not show any emotion on the face. When the mother is not showing any emotion, is not really responsive and attentive to their young children who are like infants or toddlers, the children become very emotionally distressed very quickly. And then if you can imagine, that's just an experiment, right? But if you can imagine, for example, a mother or a father who is going through severe depression in the home, and if that child is experiencing that on a daily basis for an extended amount of time, where they're not getting much emotional, expressional feedback, not really having a responsive back and forth with a parent, that can be very distressing to the child and then could have some negative impacts to the child's well-being and mental health. So I think there are definitely impacts on the children.
Your question resonated with me because as a Cambodian American, like the history of Cambodians coming to the US stems from war in Cambodia. And so when my parents and my grandmother came here, they brought some generational trauma that has passed on. And so that question and then your answer, I was like, yes, you can see it in the parenting and the way that parenting happens. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and so we couldn't get to Nicole's question. We apologize, Nicole. But thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Judge Matthew. Thank you, Dr. Liu. And one final thing, my thoughts as I was listening to both of you, seeing first Judge Matthew's data, I was like, wow, Asians have no problems. And that's the common thing we see with, and that's why people believe the model minority myth is we have lower rates of cancer, lower rates of heart disease, lower rates of obesity, lower rates of convictions. But if you go into the nuances of the research and when you start disaggregating and looking at the different ethnic groups, start looking at acculturation and generational status, we start seeing that no, there are problems, there are concerns, and it'll be interesting to see how that then unfolds with your work over the generations if we start seeing more. Hopefully we won't, but we'll see how that unfolds. So thank you all for being here today. There's a poster session. There's also refreshments going on after this. If you don't stay, I hope we see you tomorrow, bright and early. I don't think too bright and early, like a little bit after 8, but hopefully we'll see you tomorrow too.